Okay, so I wanted to preface this discussion with a bit of an explanation for what I'm trying to do here. It's my view that a lack of discussion is one of the main illnesses of our country. People don't talk, at least not with those they don't agree with. That task seems to be left to just a select couple of people. People seem perfectly happy to unfriend, unfollow, and whatever other e-wall they can use to exclude the person from their life if they don't agree with them. This is my effort to continue to push for civilized discourse on meaningful topics, and hopefully to examine some issues that just aren't being discussed. Now, if you're familiar with what I do, you'll know that religion is a major topic of interest for me. And while many of the discussions I want to facilitate and have will have to do with religion, I do plan on including, everything going on in the world today eventually at some point, as long as the topic isn't too taboo to pursue. For these initial videos, I'm focusing on morality. I plan to do 3 separate discussions with 3 separate people, where we focus on 3 questions. What is morality? Where does it come from? And how do we use it? I anticipate that the last question is the one that will likely take a variety of different directions, depending on who I'm speaking with. Lastly, I want to make sure that it's clear that these discussions are going to be between ordinary people. And by that I mean that these discussions are intended to be conversations that anyone can have, that none of the language is out of their reach, that it's discussions that people can, after watching this, if they feel like it, that they can continue these discussions. I don't want it to feel like these are discussions out of anyone's reach. We're all philosophers here in these discussions. We should not be afraid to share and defend our own opinions, and I'm hoping that that gets across to anyone who's watching the video. This first discussion is with someone I consider to be a good friend. We've had several discussions for a long time, and while I've never met him in person, they're always fruitful exchanges. So I hope you enjoy this initial discussion on morality. So we can start with just who each of us are, where we fall on the religion spectrum, and then we can start into the questions. So do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Logan Embry, and I have been a Christian for about 12 years now, and that's where I'm coming from and kind of where my perspective is, and started off in evangelical Protestantism, but am now an Orthodox Christian and have been a member of the Orthodox Church for a little bit of time now. I live in Central PA and work in the architectural glass industry, so I spend most of my time doing that and being a father to my 8-year-old boy.
All right, cool. So I live down here in North Carolina. I'm a Deist and just interested in all things on these topics and all kinds of discussions I can get involved in. And hopefully we can dig into some useful information here, or at least have some interesting discussion. And I want to, one of the things that I wanted to accomplish here is to have these discussions as just 2 average people, just me and you, no doctors of philosophy, no psychologists, just the two of us discussing it. And that's what I'm hoping as I share the video around, to get people's opinions. Hopefully that'll be somewhat appealing. Just two regular, ordinary people talking about what arguments mean the most to them and what gets them the farthest on these topics. And there'll be at least 3 videos on this topic, and then later pick other topics and do more videos on those. So the first question that we'll come to is, what is morality? And then we'll move on to where does it come from, and then we'll move on to how it kind of plays out and ways that it's used. So that's the first question for you. What is morality?
Yeah, I would say morality is the distinction between right and wrong, the distinction between good and bad. And so, yeah, I don't know if you want to jump immediately to where does that come from, but I think that is kind of just the simple definition of what morality is.
Okay, so as far as everybody else, you think everyone's got the same moral convictions? Is any of this based on how they were raised and brought up, educated?
Yes, yeah, I think that upbringing certainly has an impact on one's understanding of good and bad, right and wrong. And so, yeah, I think that everyone has some standard of morality. And I think we do see a common thread running through everyone's understanding of morality. Not to say that they're all exactly the same. Obviously, there's big differences between, Christians understanding morality and someone that would live in a third world country, be a part of like a pagan tribe or something. Their understanding of morality, but yeah, I do think that upbringing certainly has to do with that. Culture has to do with that. And yeah, those would definitely be some of the things that kind of shape and mold one's understanding of morality.
Do you think any of it is innate?
Yeah, I do actually. I would say that everyone has a conscience, and even though we can suppress our conscience, and do things against our conscience, I do think we all have one, and that our consciences are a part of us being created in the image and likeness of God. And so, as those who've been created in the image and likeness of God, we have that sense of morality. We're born with that sense of morality. Now, certainly that's shaped and molded by our culture, our upbringing, but I do think that yes, the morality is in some sense innate.
So you think there's one of the ways that I've always thought about it was that there's sort of these bigger, more fundamental questions of morality that everyone seems to have, and that the nuances, the really fine tuning of the situation, the morally correct way to view each situation, seems to be more influenced by the way people are raised and things like this. But the main thread of it seems to be, grounded in empathy, something like the Golden Rule, seems to be the main thing that everyone understands and that they apply it some odd way. The example I could think of was like, well, maybe, everybody might understand and feel that their conscience tells them not to kill someone. But if something about the way they've been raised, educated, indoctrinated makes them believe that killing someone sends that person to a better place,
Mm.
then the application of that fundamental moral understanding about killing can be bent that way. So I think in that light, I think that's where the good discussions are to be had, the sort of debate over the applicability of it. So would you equate morality with conscience?
No, I would say that our conscience is something that allows us to have an innate sense of what is moral and immoral. But no, I wouldn't say that morality is exactly the same thing as the conscience. The conscience maybe could be described as an instrument through which morality, an innate sense of morality, exists.
What do you think about the phrase moral conscience?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I guess it depends on the context.
So if someone, like if you were presented with a scenario and then someone said, what does your moral conscience tell you about this scenario? Is that just them equating the two, or is that just like an implementation of, just a specific kind of conscience?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. I think maybe that they're paired together because they're definitely inseparable. Because, like I said, I think the conscience is the means through which we have that internal sense of what's moral and immoral. But I'm trying to think of conscience pertaining to something else. So, you have moral conscience and maybe conscience as far as something else is concerned. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, ultimately, that's what our consciences do. They allow us to know and have a sense of what's right and wrong.
So can your conscience be wrong?
Yes. I think it can be. I think someone's conscience can be shaped and molded by a distorted perspective, and that someone's conscience can bind them to something that's immoral. And so with that, I would say conscience is not the only determining factor in how we should understand morality, but it is one way, and it's certainly a big way.
Okay, makes sense. I haven't heard anything specifically that I would disagree with. Yeah. All right, so now you already touched on it a little bit, but let's go ahead and move on to the question 2, which is, where does it come from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so from my perspective, and I like what you said real quick about 2 average people, because I am an Orthodox Christian, but I by no means speak officially on behalf of the Orthodox Church or anything like that.
Sure, yeah.
I enjoy reading philosophy, theology, history, but I am by no means an expert. I'm by no means a scholar. But as far as where does morality come from my perspective, we already touched on the conscience, which I would say is the internal law of God, and then we have, I would say, the external law of God, which is summarily comprehended in the Decalogue or the 10 Commandments. And so with that, I would say that God's law, the law or morality, I apologize, comes from God, and it comes from His law.
Now, would you say that so you said morality, just make sure you said morality comes from His law.
Yes.
And you said internal and external?
Yes.
So when you say external, you said the Decalogue. Does that include anything else in as far as the Hebrew? You know where I'm going with that. I mean, as far as the Judeo-Christian laws go, does that include anything outside of the Decalogue?
No, I would say it's that the external law, the external moral law, is summarily comprehended in the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. There were other laws that were a part of Old Testament Judaism, the ceremonial laws and the juridical laws pertaining to the nation of Israel specifically. But I would say that what we see in the Decalogue is it transcends culture, transcends time, and that as the New Testament talks about, it is in some sense written upon every man's and woman's heart.
So do you feel like there's no part of the Ten Commandments that conflicts with your morality?
I don't believe so, no.
So this is where, a few of my, and we've talked about some of this before, but that's where a few of the troubles that I have come in, as far as the Ten Commandments go, because this is the first time we see this sins of the father being visited upon the children. Logically and morally, I have trouble squaring that idea. But the Decalogue is not the first place it appears, but it's certainly there. What do you think about that?
If you don't mind, real quick, if I could pull up that passage in Exodus. I know what you're talking about, but it'd be easier if I have that in front of me.
It's mentioned, I think, 3 times. The first being in the Decalogue, and then later after that, where it's visiting the sins of the father upon the children of the 3rd and 4th generation.
Okay. Yeah, I got it pulled up now. It looks like the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, where it says that I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generations, to those who hate me, showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments.
So okay. I have a sort of fundamental moral and reason-based objection to visiting the sins of anyone upon their children. And I have trouble squaring that with the morality I have in me. So if I have a moral conscience that tells me, that rebels against that idea, which I think if you broke it down as far as it would go, I think a big part of the entire Judeo-Christian foundation is based on this. Original sin, being carried on and inherited to future generations. So where would you say that my moral conviction that I have that tells me that this is wrong, where would you say that comes from?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that last part there?
Okay, so if I've got, if my moral conscience and, we can get into reason and logic, but, just since we're talking about morality, if my moral conscience tells me pretty fundamentally and unambiguously that that's an immoral concept, where would you say that moral conscience gets that idea? If it's from God and this idea here is from God, there seems to be a conflict as far as what I'm endowed with and what I'm reading.
So I think your concern is children being punished for the evil actions that their parents have committed,
Right.
and that being immoral. And I don't think that's taking into account the context here. And so this is where, even though I would say this is the Ten Commandments are a summary of what the moral law is that transcends culture, that transcends time, that is written on every human being's heart. I would still say that, certainly this passage was written in a certain cultural and historical context. And so with the Old Covenant, with the Mosaic covenant that God had made with the nation of Israel, there was this understanding of to you and to your offspring, right? And so you had generational blessings, generational promises, and generational curses. And I think that was the way that things operated. And but at the same time, I don't think it's this understanding of, okay, if a child is being negatively affected by the sins of their parents, regardless of whether they're, guilty of that evil themselves, God's still going to punish them for that. I don't think that's necessarily what the text is implying, because I think we see elsewhere in the Old Testament, like in Ezekiel 18, that the child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. And so I also think that in the context of the Decalogue, the text is talking about something that's typically true, experientially, right? That many a times righteousness and unrighteousness is passed on from parents to their children. Now, that's not to say that, children can't make their own choices, but children typically follow in the footsteps of their parents, right? And like we talked about, as far as conscience is concerned, upbringing, certainly has a lot to do with the way that a person's understanding of morality is shaped and molded.
So can you give me an example of that, so we've got something to kind of examine?
Something as far as like a generational,
Yeah.
A generational blessing or a generational curse.
Yeah, but whatever you feel best would fit the passages we're talking about here.
Okay. As far as an example that we see in the context of the Old Testament itself.
Well, but just before you start, but you're saying that the Decalogue is a summary of what's written on our hearts, right?
Yes.
So there's only so much in the context of the Old Testament that can really be said here if it's supposed to be written on all of our hearts.
Yes. Yeah. And that's where, undeniably there is an element of this passage that is unique to the culture and unique to the time, right? But I do think that there's also an element of this passage that transcends culture, that transcends time, and that all of us know and experience ourselves. So yeah, let's go with the example. So an example of, I think, and I'll connect this with our experience now, but I would say an example in the context of the Old Testament itself is like the Babylonian captivity, right? So even though the children may have not been personally guilty for the sins that were committed that ended up leading the nation of Israel into captivity and into exile, they're still going to, experience the curse of that, right? And but if you look at, so that would be a generational curse in the context of the Old Testament itself, and then a generational blessing in the context of the Old Testament itself would be, the promised land, right? The land flowing with milk and honey, that the Israelites inherited, even though the children didn't really, contribute to that, at least not, in infancy. They still experience the blessings of that. And so I think the way that translates to our experience now is that, things that our parents do certainly affect us, whether they be good or bad, and I think that's the general principle that's at play here in the passage that we all know to be true and we all, experience ourselves. I would say that principle, though, that typically is not what is the focus of what's contained in the Decalogue, even though it's there. The Decalogue is typically kind of the different parts of this passage that are typically focused on are just the simple commandments. And so even though this principle is right there in the passage, I would say that's not really a big focus. I mean, I think we all know that to be true, right? Our parents, our fathers and mothers, right, and affect our experience, our understanding of morality, our, whether we experience blessings or curses. But
before we get into the objections that I would have to that example, just right quick, how influenced, what's the wording I'm looking for? How inerrant do you view this text, and how much of this could be obscured by human attempt? Because I'm going to talk about the specific wording, and if you're not in a position where the wording holds a specific value, where you could just say, okay, well, that could just be from humans messing up the words. So before I get into my thoughts on it, because like I said, it's gonna be in the wording. How do you view these passages in that light?
As far as whether they could contain error or not? Yeah.
So I mean, like how much of, like if I discuss a certain word or the use of a certain phrase, I've been in discussions before where someone could say, okay, well, that was just the wrong word to use, and that's just blamed on humans. Blamed on the author. So how inerrant and perfect do you view the Decalogue?
So I would say, first off, what's important is to make the distinction, at least from my perspective, between transmission and translation. So I would say that there's not been an issue with the transmission of this text, and I would consider it, to be inerrant in its original language, and believe, God to have providentially preserved this text. But as far as the translation is concerned, I would definitely say that, there can be a word that could be mistranslated,
Okay.
At the same time, what's difficult for me to even say that is that I don't know Hebrew, right? I can't read Hebrew. So I'm trusting and I'm at the mercy of the translators, and trusting that they're translating this accurately. But at the same time, there are many different translations, and I think it can be useful to kind of try to understand the etymology of the words in their original languages and look at the different translations, compare.
And the oldest Decalogue we have would be the Dead Sea Scrolls, right?
So from the Orthodox perspective, we would hold the Greek Septuagint. We would believe that holds a little bit more weight, at least from my understanding, because we would say that that's the text that the apostles used, And even
No, I
though,
mean it just as far as age, though.
okay, yes, yeah, no, I understand what you're saying
Yeah.
there. Yes.
So when you say inerrant in its original form,
Hmm.
you're essentially speaking to something we don't have and nobody's ever seen.
I would say the content has been providentially preserved.
Right.
We may not have the original manuscripts, right? The papyri of the original manuscripts, but I would say that it's been providentially preserved, and I would argue that not based upon blind faith. I think there's good evidence as far as the manuscript. There's good proof as far as the manuscript evidence is concerned that that we do have what the original manuscript contained.
Okay. So as far as the so the examples you gave, right? The uh, sort of this kind of intuitive whatever we do can contribute to the misfortunes of our children. This kind of thing where I could, like investment, right? If I invest a lot of money into retirement and trying to create an inheritance for my children, that's
Mm-hmm.
obviously better than me just squandering everything. And then of course my behavior can create bad behavior in them and everything. Um, and then the biblical example that you were giving, was like the actions of the parents leading to the eventual enslavement of their children.
Mm-hmm.
The two objections that I have to that is that's not God visiting anything on anyone, and second, that in what sense is it jealousy?
Mm. Why are you saying that's not God visiting anything on anyone?
Well, so if I do something that results in a worse life for my children,
Mm-hmm.
that's the result of my actions. The verse says that God is visiting something upon the children, as it's an action He's taking
Mm-hmm.
instead of anyone else. So it's not anything He's doing that's creating that worse situation for my children. It's something I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
And were that the wording of the passage, there would be no moral objection. So whatever I do can obviously result in bad things for my children. Or if, like if the biblical example, if I do something that results in my people being enslaved and then my children are enslaved, obviously it's not their fault that they're enslaved,
Mm-hmm.
but that's different than God visiting something on them. Because the way it's worded, it's God's action and it's rooted in God's jealousy. And both of these examples have nothing to do with jealousy.
Mm. Yeah, I would say it's rooted in God's jealousy because of the way that God, interacted with the people of Israel specifically, and then even now, I would say in a lot of ways, the way that He interacts with us. I think we do see this principle of to you and to your children, even after the cessation of the old covenant, because I think the family is something that is very important to God. Where our interaction to Him is not just on an individual level, but on a familial and corporate level as well.
But as far as what we're doing, so let's say, in the current example, I rack up a bunch of debt. Everything's repossessed after I die, putting my children in a much worse situation.
Mm-hmm.
Or take it back to an Old Testament, something I do, maybe an ill thought out attempted siege or something, and it results in my people being enslaved. Both of those things would happen and play out to be true, regardless of how God feels about it, because there's no action He needs to take for those things to happen.
Mm.
And it would have nothing to do with jealousy. So if, let's say it happened while I'm still alive, I've done something, my people have become enslaved, and then my child walks up to me and says, why am I also a slave? And I say, well, because God's jealous. That's not going to make any sense. He's a slave because of my actions, not rooted at all in any kind of feeling that God has. And if this was the intention of the passage, was to communicate this, I think it didn't quite successfully get that intention across. Because those two things, because it seems to be an action God's taking, and because it says it's jealousy. Because I don't see in what sense any of that, my children resulting in being enslaved somehow, or in my children resulting in not having the financial means to be successful in life because of my choices. None of that has anything to do with God being jealous.
Okay, I would say that I do see a connection between divine jealousy and what we could call covenant faithfulness. Is that the people of Israel under the Mosaic covenant would be faithful to the covenant that God made with them, because He's a jealous God, right? And He desires devotion, and that His people would serve Him and worship Him. And then I would say even us now, under what's called the New Covenant, inaugurated by Christ. There's definitely a connection between the importance of what we could call covenant faithfulness and divine jealousy. But I'm not sure if I'm explaining how there's a connection there. But
yeah, I would have trouble connecting that to the practical application of the concept of that passage, being that our decisions result in a worse scenario for our children. That plays true no matter what the God's opinion. And what action is He taking there?
So would you rule out the possibility of God kind of causing things to work that way, orchestrating things that in such a way that there would be generational blessings and curses?
Well, if that were the case, then we're back to the moral problem. Because if that's the idea, if the son suffers because of the father, and that's because it's been engineered to work that way, if a moral mind would do what it could to prevent that. So, I always get a little hesitant when it gets onto that topic, and I've had that discussion with many Calvinists before, because there's this sort of I forget the language they use now, but there's this idea that everything is determined to happen that way, and which really, it destroys free will and choice making. And if that's if that's the case, if my choice is resulting in a poorer life for my children, is because God made it that way, instead of it just logically and reasonably working out that way. Let me put it to you this way. Let's say you're in charge of that system, and you say, okay, this person has a child, and they're making really poor financial decisions. They're losing everything, and then their child's going to have a worse off life. If there was any way you could make that better for the child, wouldn't you?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So when you bring it back around to that direction, then the moral problem comes in, instead of just the question of the wording of the passage. So that would be my main two objections there, so as far as that implementation of the passage. So I'm in a position where I'm trying to consider. Let me back up and put it this way. The way that I usually preface these discussions about morality with the more religious people, with the theists, is I'll say, okay, so we both have a sense of morality. We both seem to observe this in everyone else. And if you say it must come from somewhere, then I'll say, okay, I'm not convinced that's true, but I'll follow you on the hypothesis and let's discuss it. And they say, okay, it comes from God. And I'll say, okay, I'm not convinced that that's true, but I'll follow you on the hypothesis and we'll discuss it. And they say, so because God is perfectly moral, is the standard of good. You say, okay, well, I'm not convinced that's true, but we'll follow you on the hypothesis. And the conditions that would create for the discussion, the sort of parameters for that discussion is if all the available, if someone makes a claim about God or God's actions or God's behavior, if all the available evidence conflicts with our moral conscience, then we are then on good footing to reject it. That's true. Then conversely, if all of our moral consciences are okay with it, if it's a claim that is perfectly moral, we're not under any obligation to embrace it as true, but we could say that it could be true. So you neither obligation are you forced to make the conclusion that anyway is true, but that then is the parameter which you discuss all these actions attributed to God. If all the available evidence says that it conflicts with your moral conscience, then we can reject it. Say until something else comes along, we're going to conclude that this one is not applicable here. But then if the description of God's act is moral and conforms perfect to our moral conscience, we can say, well, I'm not going to conclude that it's true, but I'll say that it could be true. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's sort of the way that I look at all this. And I've not been able to find a way that I can view this inherited sin in a way that squares with my moral conscience.
As far as inherited sin is concerned, I, as an Orthodox Christian, have a different perspective on that than Protestants tend to have, where I would not say that children inherit the guilt of sin, but that they inherit the effects of sin and the brokenness of sin, and in that children have inherited a weakened nature. So prior to the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden, I would say that there was not this weakened nature did not exist, but by disobeying God, I would say that unavoidably we inherit this weakened nature because of sin. So I wouldn't say that the guilt of sin is passed on, and I've heard Protestants explain it that way, where the sin that Adam committed because of the evil that Adam committed because of original sin, it is as if we committed that act. It is as if we ate from the tree, from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I disagree with that. That frankly doesn't make any sense, because we didn't do that, right? But I would say that we have certainly inherited the effects of that decision. We have inherited that weakened nature as those who are, Adam's offspring.
And when you say weakened nature, you're essentially referring to mortality, right?
That's definitely a part of it. The way, and I think a helpful way is one Orthodox priest, the way he explains it is that sin is death in hiding. Death is sin made visible. And so absolutely, I would say there's mortality definitely has to do with that weakened nature.
Death is sin made visible.
Yes.
And he would even say that about an infant?
Yes. That's not to say that infant died because of a sin that he or she committed, but that the sin that has been the cause of our weakened nature is made visible in our mortality.
So let's perform the same hypothetical experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to Adam and Eve and the eating of the forbidden fruit, the knowledge of good and evil. First of all, right quick, would you say that infants are born with knowledge of good and evil?
Whether they're if they're born with the knowledge of good and evil, yes, I would say they are.
Okay. So let's put you in the place of someone who can design this system, who has a moral conscience. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If you've set up a system where the two humans in it, if they break this taboo that you put on them about this tree, they eat the fruit. Is it a moral decision to say that would then curse their children? Or would it be the moral thing to conclude that their children should not then suffer and die because of Adam and Eve eating of the forbidden fruit?
I would say that, so the warning that God gives Adam and Eve, that if you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die. I think first off, it's important for us to keep in mind that he doesn't say, I will kill you, right? He says, you will die, right? So he's warning them of the consequence of what will happen if they eat of this fruit, which I would not say that fruit was inherently bad. They were eating something. They were participating in something that God was not ready for them to participate in.
So why would, again, to ask the moral question, why even tempt them?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, isn't that in itself a moral question? If you say, okay, I'm going to put a rule in place here, mm-hmm, that the punishment for breaking it will damn your children. Isn't that in itself morally questionable?
Well, so I wouldn't say that they're, Adam and Eve's offspring are automatically damned because of this, right?
They don't inherit the fragility and
They inherit mortality, but they don't automatically inherit damnation. I would.
Oh, okay. So yeah, that was a bad word. Sorry, I didn't mean to imply it that way. That being the punishment that you're going to suffer and die, because that's essentially the result of all this, is suffering and death. Yes. Isn't it in itself morally problematic to put such a scenario in place? I mean, let alone the rules. Mm-hmm. So if you've got two options there, one's the tree with the knowledge of good and evil. Mm-hmm. And then one's the tree with the knowledge of good and evil, only the rules are slightly different. So let's imagine the one that's there, if you eat of it, you and your children are going to suffer and die, even though they didn't do anything. And then let's say we've got another tree that if you eat from it, you yourselves will die. Mm-hmm. But anyone else, like your children who have not yet eaten from the tree of good and evil, would live. Isn't that the more moral scenario?
I think so. You had talked about your issue with the way that Calvinists describe, their perspective with how God interacts with the world, and that He predestines absolutely everything that comes to pass, and how that removes free will, and that to you is immoral. Well, I would say this is part of free will, is not only giving the opportunity for mankind to use their wills to do what is right, but also the possibility of them using their free wills to do what is wrong.
Well, but that's a different concept than using their free will to do something which condemns all future generations to suffering and death. That's different, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting thought to say, okay, God gave them. I mean, Eve was named the mother of all living before this happened, right? So, and they were given the command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, right? So there was a knowledge, there was an understanding that, okay, we are to procreate and pass along these things to our children, to our offspring, right? And so they already had that knowledge, and then God warning them of what would happen if they ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. It's interesting to look at all of that and then say, well, why didn't God just provide a better scenario?
Not necessarily a better scenario, just a more moral one.
Okay.
Because I can certainly construct a more moral scenario than that, just in the hypothetical discussion of it. Because where it breaks down on moral standards is when this suffering and death is then experienced by the children who did not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
It would seem to me to be more friendly to the idea of free will and to the idea of letting humanity make their own decisions, to letting each generation then make some detrimental choice to their life, which I think would in the end be a more observably true and probably embraced religion, if that were the case, because it would be where a lot of these things seem to break down is with, if an infant or a barely of age child gets some sort of awful illness and suffers and dies, in that light, we're forced to say, okay, well, that's that frailty, their mortality, the reason that they are now dead is at least in part to blame on something someone did a long time ago, who I nor this child ever knew. That there's a morality problem there, where a more moral scenario can be created. And I know that the obvious caveat to that is that someone would say, well, you don't know what God knows. Right? And that's true. That's true. I don't know what God knows.
Seems like a pop out, though, from your perspective, right?
It absolutely is, yeah. And because I'm just trying to weigh these claims about God's nature and the things that God said and did against my own moral conscience. And that, in the end, is always what pushes me away from biblical belief, is that I would be then forced to embrace something contrary to the moral conscience that I feel working inside of me. And original sin is one of those things. And I know a lot of beliefs are now moving towards the mythological element of Adam and Eve, instead of embracing that whole story as having taken place. It's more of a mythology around the early Hebrews. And that makes sense to me, but it's not everybody's made that choice. But you would say, as an Orthodox Christian, and sorry for confusing it when we first started talking about this, I was thinking that was some flavor of Catholicism. But could you, right quick before we continue, could you kind of explain where Orthodox Christianity fits in all the main denominations of things?
So, yeah, the Orthodox Church would say that it is pre-denominational. It existed prior to the Protestant Reformation. That occurred in the 16th century, and so Christianity, starting with Christ and the apostles, was continued through the churches of the East and West. And so most people understand the West to have historically been, the Catholic Church, and the East to have historically been the Orthodox Church. But for, I would say, most of history, they were one. They were united. And there were some issues regarding how the authority of the Bishop of Rome was to be viewed, and how that played into the Church's understanding of the Trinity and the relationship that the Holy Spirit had to the Father and the Son. And so that caused a bit of a schism. And most people put that date at 1054, but it was already kind of starting to happen. There was already issues between the Orthodox Church of the East and the Catholic Church of the West. But when they were united, it would be, from my understanding, it was referred to as the Orthodox Catholic Church, united, but existing in both the East and the West. So there was a split. And so we don't necessarily have a Pope figure like the Catholic Church does because of that split, but we would claim antiquity just as much, if not more, than the Catholic Church does to the ancient faith that was established by Christ and his apostles.
Interestingly, I know that some parts of the Baptist denomination claim that the Baptist Church, even though I don't know how they prove this, but they would claim that the Baptist Church goes all the way back to John the Baptist, and that there were periods that it was in hiding, but that it only, really came out, 19th century was when it really, decided to rear its head again.
Yeah.
So when you say claim antiquity, you're talking about the old church, the old.
Yeah, the ancient church that was established by Christ. And so, you're going to have, everyone wants to have that claim to antiquity, right? Because nobody wants to say, hey, I've started something completely new that has absolutely no connection to what was established in the first place. But we would say, it's abundantly clear from history that we are the continuation of that church that existed, in the first century. And we can see that when we look at the historical data, when we look at the writings of the early church fathers, when we look at the ecumenical councils, when we look at the liturgical worship of the ancient church, we can see that this is the Orthodox Church is certainly a continuation of that. And so that would be, I think, the difference. We wouldn't make that claim of antiquity and then say, but there's no evidence for it, conveniently enough, because the church was just in hiding. We would say, no, there's clear evidence that we're doing the same stuff they were doing back then, and stuff that they were doing back then that's contained in extra biblical documents, such as like like I said, the things that we see from like the writings of the early church fathers and some of the early catechetical documents from the early Christians.
So, what then is the Pope then the main distinguishing feature, or is there some fundamental doctrinal difference between Orthodox Christianity and the Catholic Church?
Yeah, the Pope would be the big one. Actually, the two things that a Catholic convert to the Orthodox Church, the two things that they have to publicly renounce when they're received into membership is the papacy, and the what's called the filioque, which those things I think in a lot of ways are inseparable. As we're going to talk about the way that the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church kind of separated, because the Nicene Creed, when it talks about the Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father, and this is something that is fairly complex. It's in a lot of ways it's a philosophical discussion, but when the Catholic Church inserted that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, that's what filioque means, and the Son. Then that's where the Orthodox Church started to say, okay, the Pope is starting to abuse his authority and pushed back against this understanding of the Bishop of Rome having immediate universal jurisdiction. I don't know if that answers your question, but I might have went on a kind of off subject a little bit there.
What do you think about the Jerusalem Bible?
I'm not very familiar with it, actually. I know some people who use it, but I believe it contains the like what people call the apocryphal books. Is that right? Or
yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
I don't have a copy of it here with me, but I think it contains Maccabees and
yes,
yeah. I used to know this. I had it memorized because I remember bringing it up in my first debate.
Mm-hmm.
There was two other books, and I don't remember. It was Maccabees and two others.
There's Tobit. There's the Wisdom of Solomon.
Wisdom of Solomon. Yeah, that's what it was. Wisdom of Solomon. Yeah. So that would be an interesting thing to figure out as far as the separation between Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism goes. Was it before or after Wisdom, Tobit, and Maccabees? Because as far as I know, Wisdom, Tobit, and Maccabees was never taken out as far as the Catholics go. It was just taken out by other denominations.
Mm-hmm.
And would you say that the Orthodox Church followed suit?
Yeah, that's something that the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church are mainly in agreement on, is that those books, First and Second Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, we would refer to them as deuterocanonical, meaning they are a part of the canon of Scripture. They are to be regarded as authoritative Holy Writ, but they have a bit of a different place in the tradition of the church. And so it wasn't until the Protestants came along and started to kind of call those books into question that they were removed from worship services and readings and stuff like that, because it wasn't obviously until the printing press that we had leather-bound Bibles, right? But we would say that those books were always a part of the tradition of the church.
Okay, makes sense. All right, so we're going to let's move on to the last question. And this one might be a little bit, I was trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to explore with the third topic.
Mm-hmm.
And I was having trouble figuring out exactly how to word it. But essentially, it's a discussion of how morality plays out in our lives,
mm-hmm.
and what's the causes for doing it wrong, how can it be employed better, and how what's the best way to approach these questions, which are clearly moral questions.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that this always reminds me of is it was something kind of based on, I'm sure you've seen the Weinberg quote that, with or without religion, good people will do good things and wicked people will do wicked things. But if you want good people, if you want a good person to do a wicked thing, you need religion. And I think that would extend to any kind of indoctrination or dogma. And in the end, the translation of that, the sort of the way that I think it applies, is that without something convincing people to ignore their moral conscience, minus something like damaging the brain, then what has to happen is someone to be indoctrinated with something that makes them view their moral conscience as flawed or inaccurate, which I think plays out in the world today.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think is the best way to avoid all that and sort of free ourselves the most from any kind of bias that would influence our moral decisions?
Yeah, so my first thought is, conscience is extremely important. And from the Christian perspective, we would say that the conscience is a good thing. But at the same time, we would say that our consciences are not always in tune with what is objectively, moral or immoral. And so that's why they shouldn't be the determining factor in trying to kind of have a proper understanding of morality. But so you were talking about, though, brain damage could negatively affect someone's conscience,
right?
And I guess I would have to ask. Okay, so this would go back to original sin, right? And the there's something broken in us. There's something wrong with mankind, right? We're not perfect creatures, right? We do wicked things. We think evil thoughts. But would you say that apart from brain damage or something like that someone naturally has an undefiled conscience that's perfectly in tune with what is objectively moral and immoral?
I would say that on the major fundamental, I'm not sure exactly what language you use there, but on the main parts rooted in empathy, I think that everyone does. But where it varies is when it becomes the more nuanced, finer points of it, where people start presenting hypothetical situations and you start trying to figure out, like the whole directing the train towards the one person or five, the sort of moral
gymnastics.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. It's not so much the case, but undeveloped brains, like in children, that's a little bit different story. But minus some sort of damaging of the brain, I think most people, well, I would think all people, minus some sort of damaging of the brain or indoctrination, all people would know that murder was wrong. They might still do it, but the moral conscience and this overall observation of human behavior suggests that everyone knows that murder is wrong, but they might be pushed to do it by what they feel is some reason to reject that moral conscience. Like the example that I gave earlier, if someone's been indoctrinated with the idea that if they kill their neighbor and their neighbor's in a better place, then they can convince themselves to ignore that moral conscience. That's the sort of indoctrination that I'm talking about. And that's why I think that Weinberg quote, while it's really good, I don't think it's limited to religion. I think that that can enclose anything that indoctrinates somebody to the point of ignoring their own moral conscience, any kind of dogma, which I don't think dogma is limited to religion.
Yeah, and I would have a very wide understanding of what religion is. I think religion, it doesn't just have to be this organized institution, that people belong to, but fundamentally religion is what our worldview is. You know, and in that way, I think everybody is by nature religious. Everyone is by nature committed to a certain set of morals, values, you know, and so, yeah, I no, but I would agree with you as far as indoctrination or something, some type of brain damage, throwing off someone's conscience.
Right, right. So you would agree that everyone would innately have that sort of moral conscience that tells them something like murder is wrong.
Yes, yeah, I would say that everyone by nature, and by virtue of their conscience, is aware of murder being immoral.
So you were talking about that we're all damaged. You know, this sort of, I think you were trying to relate that back to Adam and Eve, right? This sort of, you know, when I said that minus some sort of damaging of the brain,
Yes.
I think you were saying that Adam and Eve's action resulted in the damaging of the brain. But in order for that to play out, wouldn't Adam and Eve, before having eaten from the tree of good and evil, have to have been damaged in order to break this commandment they were given?
I would say no, because the free will is part of our nature.
But
right?
Didn't they choose to do the wrong thing?
Yes, they used their free will to do something that was immoral.
So then the damagedness isn't needed then. So we could all use our free will to choose to do something that's immoral without having been damaged.
So I would say, okay, I have the free will to, you know, murder somebody. But I would say that in certain ways, I would not be damaged by that action, by actually bringing myself to commit that evil.
Okay. So I may have failed to get that point across. What I was saying was, if our damaged nature, which I'm assuming you're talking about our, let's say, tendency to sin,
yes,
is rooted is the result of Adam and Eve's actions. But then the Adam and Eve's sin had no damage to base itself on. There was no further generation beyond them to damage their brains so that they could make the immoral decision. Then we don't need that damage either.
Well, we would say that with that weakened nature, there is a tendency to sin, but that doesn't mean that we are forced to sin, right? God doesn't, it's not like God caused the, Adam and Eve to have this corrupt nature by which they would commit evil against him. You know, we would say that would make God the author of evil, and that certainly would be a moral issue with the God of Christianity. But yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
yeah, I'm trying to figure out if I'm explaining it wrong.
You're saying the damaged nature, the nature that's been weakened by the effects of the fall is not needed if the ability is there. Is that what you're?
Yeah, kind of. It's sort of like if you say that our tendency to sin is the result of Adam and Eve's action, then what was Adam and Eve's tendency to sin the result of? There's no sort of, if you can go back to someone who is not damaged or in a weakened state due to anyone else's activity, and they just can by their own free will make the wrong decision, then we can also just by our own free will make the wrong decision. Then it sort of removes the need for itself. If you go, you see what I would say, does that make more sense?
Yes, I would say their nature was not yet weakened because it did not experience the effects of sin, the effects of using one's free will to disobey God and do something that was immoral. Right? There's something that happens to us when we participate in an immoral action. Right? We can have the ability to commit that immoral action, but there's something that happens to us experientially when we commit that immoral action.
So, if Adam and Eve could, by their own free will, decide to commit an immoral action,
Mm-hmm.
why can that same understanding not be applied to us? By our own free will, decide to commit an immoral action. I guess that's what I'm getting at. Is it sort of, if they can do it, we can do it, and then there's nothing about our situation that must be a result of theirs,
Mm-hmm.
of their action.
Yeah. Well, I would say the difference is having experienced the effects of those immoral actions. All right. So they had never experienced the effects of committing an immoral action. We, being born into a world that's filled with that, unavoidably do. And, so yeah, there's you're saying, why can't we go back to where they were before they committed the immoral action?
No, I guess what I'm trying to get at is the idea that we commit immoral actions because we're in this weakened state from Adam and Eve's situation.
Mm-hmm.
So the comparison would be, let's say Adam and Eve had not made that decision, and I'm just their descendant. Maybe they're still here somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Can I not, based on the same free will, make an immoral decision? It doesn't. My ability to make an immoral decision isn't necessarily. It's not necessary that it has to be tied back to their decision.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because they were able to make that decision.
Mm-hmm.
Then I could just as easily make that decision, having inherited that ability from them or not. Does that kind of get at it a little better?
Yeah. Yep. And that brings me to something you brought up, and I think this, you were talking about people approaching the early chapters of Genesis, as far as creation and the fall, from a mythological
Mm-hmm.
standpoint, and an allegory, reading it as allegory. I think, the Orthodox Church would be open to that, at least to some extent.
Would be open to the idea of Genesis being allegory?
Yeah, and even mythological. Something being mythological, I don't think means that it's automatically false, right? I think that myth can be factual in certain ways, as paradoxical as that may sound. But
myth can be factual.
Mm-hmm. In certain ways, yeah. I mean, I think mythological language has historically been used to describe something that's true, right?
Okay, that makes sense. When you word it that way, that makes sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, even if we say, the early chapters of Genesis are myth, it's using mythological language, that's fine. That doesn't mean it's not true. And I think that would be maybe what I would come back to is, either way, there's something broken in us. We have this natural tendency to commit immoral acts. Why? Where did that come from? Where did that start? And I think, if nothing else, the bare minimum we can say that had to have started somewhere, and that's what Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis is getting at. Is that there's something that happened that caused a weakening of our nature to not be neutral in deciding between good and evil, but to be more inclined towards, the ability of committing immoral acts and thinking immoral thoughts. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it's rooted in this problem of why. It's kind of like just the problem of evil. right? It's sort of trying to say there has to be some start to it, and that the story of Adam and Eve could be a mythology assembled to explain the start of that. So like Pandora's box in Greek mythology was this sort of box that people were forbidden to open, but once they opened it, greed and hate and everything came out of this box. I think that I've always compared those two stories, and sort of viewed them the same way. So you would say that there is this, not that you believe it, but you would say that there is this possibility that the Orthodox Church would view Genesis that same way, and then a lot of these problems that we're imagining may not even be problems then. They're just trying to say that evil started somewhere.
Yeah, I'm saying I think, certain Orthodox Christians would certainly be more dead set on taking a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis, but there's other people within the Orthodox Church that are open to a more allegorical, mythological interpretation. And from my, just personally, from my point of view, I think that both are getting at the same thing, right? Whether it be literal or an allegorical understanding, they're both getting at the same,
So if it's in the hypothetical situation that it's viewed allegorically, then you do end up with the real problem of infant mortality then, right?
I'm sorry, just to make sure I understand, you're saying if we approach it allegorically, we still end up with the problem of infant mortality?
Yeah, so in other words, the problem of an infant dying, if it can't be rooted literally in the action of another person, resulting in their mortality, then you still have that problem of saying, okay, well, if that whole story is allegory, then why are children dying?
Yeah, I would say it's still, even if we say it's allegorical, it's still getting at something happened that caused this fracturing, that caused this brokenness, which is ultimately made visible in the death of infants.
Okay, so if we're able to view the Adam and Eve story allegorically, how do you decide how far the allegory goes? Because if the book of Genesis is to be written by Moses, then it really doesn't become first person for a while into it, right? Moses is born in the book of Exodus, right? So
obviously Moses wasn't there, yeah.
Right. So Genesis then is all, at least to some extent, if written by Moses, Genesis is hearsay, to a great. So I think that would lend credence to the idea that it were allegory.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that's good. That Moses wasn't there, right? So he's writing in a lot of ways from his perspective. Now we would believe it to be divine revelation, but I don't agree with this understanding that I feel like Christians tend to hold to, especially in Protestant circles, where the authors of these books that we consider to be inspired scripture were like taken over by God, almost like possessed by a demon, right? Where they were forced to write these things against their own will.
Their hand was guided. They wrote it inerrantly.
Oh yeah, they couldn't help but to, and it's like, well, I think that there was a cooperation between humanity and divinity in producing sacred scripture, so that when we read the book of Genesis, yes, it's divine revelation, but unavoidably we're reading Moses's words, right? And his personality was a part of that, right? His experience was a part of that.
But does any part of this say that Moses was told all of these things, though? I mean, with some parts of Scripture, what's pushed as revelation is something that comes directly from God, right? So if I, Thomas Paine had pointed out in The Age of Reason, which, if you're a deist, you're certainly familiar with that book.
Mm-hmm.
He discussed it at length. He discussed the idea of revelation, and was talking about how revelation is something communicated directly from God to man, and that if that man tells anyone else, it's not revelation for them anymore. it's only revelation for the one guy. And this sort of pushes that scenario even farther, because what part of the book says that God told Moses what happened to Adam and Eve?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not aware of any. I mean, there's certainly a lot of sections of the Old Testament, especially when you get into the laws, that it says God spake unto Moses saying,
yes.
and there's this sort of dialogue, but that's not even there. Even, the book of Genesis isn't even pushed that way. It's sort of just a narrative that Moses wrote, or is to have wrote, about what happened before he was old enough to write. And, so I don't even know if you would be held to, I guess that's what I'm getting at. What would be your obligation then to consider the book of Genesis as a revelation?
Mm-hmm. But you're saying because Moses was not an eyewitness account to the events that took place.
Yeah, well, and there's no part of it that says that the book of Genesis was dictated to him.
So unless, I don't see that being, I don't see Genesis not explicitly stating that Moses is the author. I don't see that being an indication that Moses wasn't the author.
No, I'm not talking about Moses not being the author. I'm just saying you referred to Genesis as revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you say Genesis was a revelation?
Because I would say that it's something that God has revealed himself through, right? It's it was a part of the tradition of the Israelites, right? And I would say that, God revealed himself to them in that way. Now, and this, I feel like we could do, and this is actually something I'm trying to dig into more and study more, but I would say that doesn't mean that God didn't reveal himself to, the Greeks and the pagans, right?
Sure. Yeah, that's what I was thinking as you were going through that, was that, if just these sort of metaphorical truths throughout, and I hate that phrase, but it's something sort of forced to use. If this sort of metaphorical concepts that are used throughout the book of Genesis hold true, that could be said about any religious book anywhere.
Yeah.
I guess that the bone I was picking there was the one that says the book of Genesis specifically is a revelation. And it may be just that we're using the word revelation differently. Because I'm thinking of, revelation, something dictated from God to man. And there's nothing about the story. There's nothing in the Bible that says Genesis was ever even dictated. It's just a book that existed as a narrative that is to be written by Moses. So I guess what I'm getting at is, I don't see any reason specifically to view Genesis as more than a narrative.
Okay. Would that, why, from your perspective, would that make it hold less weight?
Okay, so when we start talking about allegory and things like that, the weight may not be what I'm getting at. I guess what I'm getting at is once we make the step of viewing the story of Adam and Eve allegorically, then we could make the step of viewing the entire book allegorically. And then the real true eyewitness story doesn't start until Moses is of age to write. Not even, you couldn't even say that the story about how he was born was eyewitness, because presumably he wrote that too, how he was born.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm sort of trying to figure out, how far the allegory plays. And to me, in some sense, if Genesis is just narrative, and tradition on what happened before Moses' birth, that puts a much different concept of the book of Genesis than many people view it and discuss it. So like you were saying, if the story of Adam and Eve is just an attempt to explain mortality or an attempt to explain evil, then it's theologically shouldn't really hold much weight for us, because then it's just somebody's attempt at explaining those things. It doesn't mean that they got it right. It's just somebody saying, well, this stuff had to have started somewhere. And me and you could say that. And then me and you could write some sort of origin story for the origin of all evil, and end up with something like Pandora's Box, for example. And that story should hold as much theological weight to us as the book of Genesis.
Yeah, I would say that from my perspective, I think first off, it's important for us to acknowledge that, it's the book of Genesis didn't just like fall out of the sky, right? It was written by Moses when obviously he wasn't there. He didn't experience those events, and was a part of the tradition of the Israelites, right, under the old covenant. So, but I would say, from my perspective, it's the most reasonable account of what took place, and that the similarities that we find in these other religions' attempt of explaining, the beginning of creation and the problem of evil, point to the truthfulness of what we see in the book of Genesis.
That's interesting. That would be an interesting rabbit hole to go down, because I would think if you were to say, okay, good and evil had some origin, it wouldn't be a stretch to push the origin back to a single person. And then it wouldn't be a stretch. One of the books that I've been reading lately is called Totem and Taboo, and it's a book by Sigmund Freud, and he was talking about the primitive tribes that he observed in Australia and other places, the way that they employed taboos in their mythology and everything. And almost all of them had this. The most primitive tribes had these taboos that were fundamental to some part of their existence and their civilization. And he was saying, okay, so if we can observe that here, we could say that likely happened with the earliest civilizations, because we know these are very young civilizations. And that was sort of his whole attempt. Obviously, it's speculation, but it reminds me of that in the way that you could say, okay, it goes back to one person and a taboo that was violated. But we're clearly being punished. It's the sort of the conclusion. Like, I don't know if you've listened to much Jordan Peterson stuff. I'm not a huge fan of his. Some of his stuff kind of, I think it gets a little shaky. But one of the things he brings up a lot is the conclusion that life is suffering. Okay. And the language he uses there is interesting. But I bring that up because that's sort of the language that I use talking about it. So if you're trying to figure out, okay, life is suffering, why is it suffering? That suffering must be a punishment. There must have been a taboo. There must have been a person that violated it long ago. And you can put together a story that looks very much like the Pandora's Box and the Tree of Good and Evil. But I think assembling it that way is
Mm-hmm.
something that can be done without those events actually ever having taken place.
Hmm.
It's just our attempt at explaining what we experience, and
Well,
in doing so, claiming to have more knowledge of the past than we could possibly know.
mhm. I think what's interesting about that though is that, as much as the Noahic flood is kind of scoffed at by skeptics of Christianity, it's such a common story in all of these other religions that this flood took place. And it's just like, okay, if this was just if this is just make believe, why do you have not only the Jews, this story being a part of the tradition of the Jews, but being a part of the tradition of all of these other religions, all of these other ancient pagan religions, and
But that's
so
that's another topic we could dig into. And instead of the story of Adam and Eve, talking about the Noah's flood.
Mhm.
One of the is okay. So I have to ask. I don't want this to be insulting, but
Mhm.
I'm not that familiar with Orthodox Christianity.
Mhm.
Where is the Orthodox Christianity in terms of the age of the earth?
There's you this goes back to what I was saying about viewing um, Genesis as literal versus allegorical. I think you're going to have your people in the Orthodox Church being dead set on the Earth being young, being 6,000 to 10,000 years. But you certainly have even Orthodox clergy open to the Earth being old, being um, millions of years old, and so there's room for both perspectives, I would say. And there's some who would even say there's room for theistic evolution.
The reason I ask is because the plausibility of Noah's flood relies a lot on the inapplicability of uniformitarianism, which is a concept I've discussed a lot just in the field of geology, but the idea that things are how they always have been.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to break that concept in order to make the flood possible.
Mm.
And just by the volume of water on the planet, you have to break that and say there must have been more. You see what I'm saying? You have to violate that uniformitarianism and say, okay, the world isn't as it always was. Something was very different before in order to make these things possible. And for young Earth creationists, that has to be broken. That's a concept that has to be shattered in order to really push that idea. And it destroys single-handedly the idea of fine tuning. That's it. Because now you're saying the universe doesn't fit on a knife edge. Now it's more like the head of a mallet, and you can have all these various adjustments that can be made and still result in humanity. So thinking about it that way, when it comes to Noah's flood, and say, okay, you have to violate this uniformitarianism in order to even consider Noah's flood. One of the things that makes the widespread story of Noah's flood so probable is that human civilization, well, I don't know if civilization is the right word, but humanity existed prior to the last ice age, as far as scientific observation has gone. And again, that's based on the idea of uniformitarianism, where the Earth is as it always has been. With that being the case, then post the last ice age, there would be an insane amount of flooding happening, as the sheer volume of glacial presence continues to melt and goes on and on and on. Then there would create a tradition in humanity of passing down the story of the Great Flood.
Mm.
That would, and this is just one. Obviously, there's no way to prove that, but this is just one plausible explanation for why worldwide there would be this idea of the Great Flood. And some cultures, of course, are younger than others. So some could have spread from the same culture that experienced the same flood before that. But that's always, and I've even read a Native American story of the Great Flood, which had, the way it was survived was that the man and his family climbed into a great basket, and with him took the kind of spirit of nature with him into the basket, and that was how they survived the Great Flood. So when you think about things like the just the physical problem of getting enough water to cover the world being a real issue for the concept of a global flood, then you can come up with that plausible explanation without breaking the concept of uniformitarianism.
So you're saying, just to make sure I understand you right, that if you hold to a literal, very wooden view of the Noahic Flood, then it's given in the book of Genesis that you have to violate the principles of uniformity in nature. Okay. Interesting.
You have to break several just ways that we observe the world to work in order to make it possible for water to cover the face of the world. And it's sort of like, because when you break these scientific concepts down to their real root basis, it's all dependent on what we observe now having always been the way matter acts. And in order to really believe, I think, the concept of young earth creationism, you have to break that concept and say, no, things aren't how they always have been. And that's a necessary step that has to be made before you can really say that the earth is less than 10,000 years old. And that's not something that I feel like we're under any obligation to do. There's no sign whatsoever that the universe has not always operated the way we observe it operating today. Anyway, so Noah's flood was a little bit different direction to go in. But do you have any other thoughts on Noah's flood as far as that goes?
No, I was just saying that, I think that, it's these other religions having that understanding as well. I get where you're coming from, where that's going to be the case because of the Ice Age,
just one plausible.
So no, that would be all my thoughts on that. But with that, I think this is what helps, because sometimes Christians can, when they're talking about divine revelation and as it pertains to the Old Testament, it almost starts to become this thing where it's like, okay, so God did all of this just for the Jews? Like, would he just not care about anyone else?
Right.
And I actually like the way C.S. Lewis has described this, where he said that yes, God revealed himself to the Jews through the Old Testament, but in the way that he interacted with them through these various covenants, but he also interacted with the Gentiles through what he calls the good dreams of the pagans. And and that's something that I'm actually trying to understand better, because this isn't a new perspective in Christianity. The earliest Christian apologist, Justin Martyr, talks about how Greek philosophy, in a certain sense, acted as a schoolmaster to bring the Gentiles to Christ. And so I think it's something that Christians need to look at is, okay, yes, we believe that there's the way that God interacted with the Jews through the Old Testament is unique and what we tend to focus on. But God also interacted with the Greeks as well in these different ways. And I think that seeing the similarities is proof of that.
Right, right. Okay. Well, we're probably nearing about what I wanted to do for the end of the period that I wanted to go through this.
Mm.
Now, we can certainly follow it up with another discussion on this. But what I'd like to do is go ahead and end this discussion so that I can exit the screen recording software. And then we can keep talking. But I want to just make sure, because once you push it on past this, then I run a real problem of it might error out, and then we lose all the recording so far. So but I appreciate you having the discussion, and
of course.
I will go ahead and exit this one, and then we'll talk some more and figure out if it's something we want to pursue a sequel of. But hopefully you enjoyed it.
Oh, of course. Yeah, definitely.
All right, cool. Well, I appreciate you doing it, and I'll go ahead and stop the video now.
Okay.